Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, and today we are continuing on in our series of building AWS Lambda functions in Java. In a previous tutorial, we looked at the quintessential hello world example, how to build our first serverless function in Java. If you missed that, I will leave a link to that in the description below, as well as a card up here somewhere. And today, we're going to make some progress with that. We're going to introduce a new library from AWS called the AWS Lambda Core Java library. So they offer a few different libraries that will assist in building your serverless functions, and this is one of them. So we're just going to build a new project. We'll pull in that dependency. We'll talk about what that dependency gives us, and we'll build out a new serverless function, upload it to AWS, and go ahead and test it out. Again, this is all part of the research that I've done for an article that I've written for the Tanzu Developer Center called Serverless Spring. So we're working up to building serverless functions in Spring using Spring Boot and Spring Cloud Function. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link to that guide in the description as well. Hey, what are we waiting for? Let's write some code. We are going to get started building Lambda functions with Java. I'm starting over here at the documentation over at docs.aws.amazon.com. I will leave a link to this part of the documentation. This is really where I started. This is where I started learning how to build serverless functions with Lambda. So here, working with Java, there's some information here. Lambda provides the following libraries for Java functions. So there's one called Lambda Java Core, which is required, defines handler method interfaces and the context object that the runtime passes to the handler. So if you're going to define your own input types, this is the only library you need. As we saw in the previous video, you don't absolutely need this to create a function, but once you get past the kind of hello worlds, you are going to need this library to get going. So there's the core library, which we're going to use today. Then there's other libraries like Java, the Lambda Java events. So anytime you have to have input types for events from different services, like I mentioned in a previous video, if you are going to listen for, say, an event, a file is dropped into an S3 bucket and you want to react to that, this is the library that you're going to need for that. Then there's also the log4j2 library and some others. So this documentation, if you want to go through it before we go through this tutorial or go through it after, there's a lot of really good stuff in here. And again, this is where I kind of learned what I needed to know to get started. So with that, let's jump over to IntelliJ and create a new simple handler using this Lambda Java Core library. Okay, so here I am in IntelliJ. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. We're going to use the Maven archetype. We're in a folder called AWS Playground, and I'm just going to call this simple handler. We're going to use the Corretto 11 JDK. Again, we're going to start with the quick start Maven archetype. We're going to choose some advanced settings here. I'm going to go ahead and use the group ID of dev.danvega, and we'll go ahead and create our project. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. Similar to before, I'm going to go ahead and add the target and source for Maven to 11. And then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this dependency, and we'll say that we want to go ahead and use JUnit Jupyter from JUnit Jupyter 5.8.2. So now we're going to need another dependency here, and we just talked about it. So if we talk about dependencies, we are going to use the AWS Lambda, and then there's the Java Core. That one is the required one that we need to start building some functions that of any value, if you will. So the current version is 1.2.1. If you go ahead, actually, we'll jump into kind of the source in a minute. So we have our AWS Lambda Java Core, and then we have our JUnit Jupyter, which we'll need for our tests. All right, so in source main Java, I'm going to go ahead and delete this app. I'm going to get rid of this test as well for now. We'll create our own test, of course, but I'm going to start with the Java class. We're going to call this simple handler. And now instead of just creating a function in here like we did in a previous tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to implement one of the interfaces that comes with that Java Core library. And one of them is called a request handler. So request handler, and that is not it because we have not refreshed Maven. So we want to say, hey, Maven, we've added that new library. Go ahead and help us out. So there it is, com.amazon.aws.services.lambda.runtime. So the request handler takes an input and an output. So we're going to say that we're going to take in a string, and we're also going to return a string. So it's complaining to us because, hey, we need to go ahead and implement that method. So I'm going to go ahead and say implement the handle request method, and that will satisfy the contract of the interface. So now what you see here is we get an input, so our string input, because we've defined the request handler as taking a string as the input. And then we also get a second argument, which is the context. So again, if we look in this particular package, so if we go com Amazon AWS Services Lambda runtime, we can see some different interfaces in here, one of which is that request handler. So we see that request handler. But we also see context. So what does context give us? So we get some information about the request. So we see the request ID. We can get a log group name. This is a big one. So if you want to find out what the function name is being executed, we can get the function name, which is nice. You can get the version, some information about the ARN, identity, some other things, and finally a logger, which is of type Lambda logger. So if we look at that, the Lambda logger can log a string or a byte array. So some really good stuff in the context that's going to help us as we're starting to write our Lambda functions. So we get that context, which is nice. So now what I'm going to do is actually say, hey, from the context, go ahead and give me that logger. So I'm going to say, give me that logger. I'll introduce a local variable here. We'll call it Lambda logger. I know it can be final, but it doesn't need to right now. So we have a logger. So now what we can do is we could say logger.log, and we can say function, and we can say, hey, from the context, give me the function name. Remember we saw that? We can get the function name, which is nice. So now we're saying, hey, go ahead and tell me which function was called. And all we're going to do is we're going to take the input and we're going to uppercase it. So we are taking a string as input and we are returning a string. This is just the uppercased version of that. So that's the entirety of our function that we're going to upload to AWS Lambda. But at this point, I want to write a test for it. And as you could start to think, this might be a little bit tricky, right? Because we take in an input, that's fine. But we have this context here. So what are we going to do about the context? So I want to go ahead and create a new test. So I'm going to create a test in here. We're going to have a test. And I'm going to have a test here. And we're going to say that this should return uppercase input. Uppercase of input. Okay, so now what we need to do is we have our system under test again, right? So our set is a new simple handler, and we have to somehow call. So like before, we might have an assertions.assert equals what is. So if we passed hello world, the expected should be hello world, and then set dot handle request, and this is where we would pass in like the lowercase version of it, right? But here's the problem. So now it's expecting a context, and this is the context is something that Amazon gives us. We don't have a context. So how do we get this? Well, I think the easiest way to do this, there are other approaches, but I think the easiest way for us to do this here is to kind of mock out the context, kind of replace the context with some type of mock. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to come in here to our pom.xml, and we're going to go ahead and add Mockito. So Mockito is a mocking library that will allow us to mock this out. So I'm going to say Mockito JUnit Jupyter. There we go. And the current version is 4.5.1. So let's not forget to reload our changes, and let's go back to our test. We're probably going to get rid of this for now, and we're going to do a couple of other things. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable to hold our simple handler. We'll call this simple handler. What I want to do is I want to mock out the context. So I'm going to say context, and this is that. So we're mocking that out. And we also want to mock out the Lambda logger because we get an instance of our logger in our simple handler, right? So when we look at this, we get an instance of Lambda logger. We also need to mock that out because we are not going to have an instance of Lambda logger in our test. So I'm going to say logger, and we're going to mock that out. So the first thing I need to do is before each, we're going to say public void setup, and in here we need to do a couple things. So we're going to use the Makito when method. So Makito.when. So when context.getLogger is called, getLogger. When that's called, then I want you to return the mocked version of it. So return the mocked version. So this will just ensure, and there's a static import for this, this will ensure that when we're in this method here, when we're calling the simple handler handle request, when this method gets called, we're going to replace that with a mock because we don't have a concrete implementation of that yet. And we won't in our tests, right? So we want a mock of that. This is where things get a little bit tricky. So we need to use the do answer static stubber from Makito, which is to select a method for stubbing. We want to stub something out here. So we're going to get a call, and we're going to basically say that, hey, when we want to stub out when the logger is called, and we call the log method with any string. So that will satisfy us because all we're doing is logging out a string. So what we're going to replace that with is the system.out.println, and we're going to say, hey, take in, let's see, we're going to say, we're going to cast this to a string, and we're going to get the call, and we're going to say get whatever the argument is at the 0 index. So we're going to cast that to a string, and that's what we're going to print out. We're going to return null here. This error is because of that. And now once that is so we're basically replacing logger.log with just system.out.println because that's all we need for a test. So again, we're mocking out our context, we're mocking out our logger. Anytime logger.log is called, we're replacing this. Now, yes, we could just get rid of this and save ourselves a whole bunch of headaches here, but I'm just showing you this. So if you want to remove these lines, you don't need to worry about the complexity of this test. But I have a feeling you're going to run into this situation at some point, so I wanted to show it to you. Finally, we're going to say, hey, go ahead and create a new instance of that simple handler so that we have that because we have our simple handler here. Oops, we called that simple handler. So create an instance of that. Now in our test, we can use that when, and we can say when context.get function name is called. So we need to return something for that. Then return, we're just going to say that is called handle request. So now that will mock out that piece. So now we should be able to say assertions.assert equals what is the expected output? So hello world. And then what are we going to call? So we have that simple handler, right? Dot handle request. So we're going to pass in an input, which is the lowercase version of that. And now we have a context that we can pass to it, which is a mocked version of the context. So if everything worked right, we should be able to run our test. And it didn't. Null pointer. This is always fun. So let's see where that happened. So context.getLogger. Then we're going to return logger. Okay, I think I forgot something here. I did. Oh, Dan. Extend with Makito extension.class. We need to extend with Makito or we're not going to get that mocked version. So let's try that again. Oh, must be a class literal. Why did I have two versions? Two little. Okay, not sure what was happening there. Let's try that again. And there we go. So cool. So, and then you could see it was printed out because we replaced that logger with the system.out.println. So it said function handle request was called. So cool. So our test works, our simple handler works. We're implementing the request handler that takes in a string and returns a string. This is ready to go. Now we just need one more thing here, right? Inside of here, we need that Maven shade plugin, which is going to give us the ability to create that Uber jar. So let's go in here and say Maven clean package. And if everything goes okay, we should have a build success. And in target, we have our simple handler.jar, which we are going to use to upload to AWS. So let's head over to the AWS console and do that. Okay, so here I am. I'm going to go ahead and create a new function. We're going to go ahead and say this is YouTube simple handler. We're going to pick a runtime. Again, this is going to be the Java 11 Corretto. We're going to choose ARM64. We're not going to get into any advanced settings yet. We're going to go ahead and create a function. And the first thing we're going to do here in our code source is go ahead and upload this from a jar. So I'm going to click upload. And in AWS Playground, I'm going to choose Simple Handler. I'm going to go into the target folder and pick the jar file we created. Click Save. Again, we have to go into the runtime settings and pick a handler. So this is dev.danvega. This was simple handler. And this is why I've been naming my methods handle requests so I don't have to change this. So we can go ahead and click save. Now we need to test this. So what it's going to do is it's going to take in, it's not taking in JSON, it's just taking in a simple string. So I love AWS Lambda, just so it's something different. And now when we test this out, let's go ahead and hit test. And we should get back the uppercase version of that, which we do. So again, you could see the duration, 66 milliseconds, 367 seconds on the cold start. If we test it again, that goes down to 19 and 20 milliseconds. And that should only increase as we run it each time. Again, if something goes wrong, you will see it in the logs. You can come over to your monitoring, check out your logs, metrics, traces. This is where you get a lot more information as to what's going on. You can also go to view logs and CloudWatch. That will give you some insights into those logs. So I think that's where we're going to stop it today. Again, this was kind of the next step in the evolution. We are building our AWS Lambda functions. We are doing so now in plain old Java, with the ability to pull in that AWS core library. So that library gave us that interface that we use. We get the context passed in. We can get some information out of the context about the environment that's happening, like the function name. We get a logger with that we can use to log. And again, that logging information is getting written to a log as we kind of test this out. You can't see it here, but this will be in the logs, right? So if you look down here, it's actually not shown. Oh, so there it is. Function YouTube simpler handler called. So that was from our logging because we use the context to get the Lambda logger, right? So now we see it in the output. So this is giving us the building blocks to start building, some real functions here. Now we need to get into things like events and, the different use cases, function URLs. There's a whole lot to get into. But this is the foundation for building serverless functions in Java. So we'll get into a whole lot more. I have a serverless Spring article. I'm going to do a video version of that as well. So if you're interested in building serverless functions with Spring, that can be something you can check out as well. So hey, if you found value in this, please do me a favor, leave some comments below. Let me know what you'd like to see next in this series. because this can go a whole lot of ways. But if you found some value, do me a favor and leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding, friends.